So your boy Ross Mason made this beautiful minimalistic interior scene in Cinema 4D and Redshift. I thought it would be fun to recreate this in Unreal Engine 5 and show you my full workflow, so model export, lighting, materials, animation and render settings, all of that good stuff. Shout out to Ross for letting me use this scene for the video. All of his links are in the description below, so please check him out. Alright, let's get started. So I'll be using the Cineware workflow, which I go over in my C4D to UE5 tutorial video. Pretty much what this does is it'll bake down all your objects that have subdivision surfaces or deformers, and it'll automatically bake all of that down so that you can non-destructively work with your file. One thing to note is if you do use Redshift or Octane tags and you have subdivision enabled like this over here, that will not get baked down, so make sure you add enough segments or subdivisions to your geometry if you need to. Another quick note, sometimes I find deformers like these do not work or get baked down successfully. So you might have to, connect and delete some things, but usually it's not an issue. One last thing, in the camera settings, if you are using film offset, that will not get ported over into Unreal because their cinematic camera does not have that capability. So you will need to make some adjustments in Unreal if you want to get the exact same shot that you do in Cinema 4D, so keep that in mind. All right, so if you hit Control D, go to Cineware. These are the settings I'm using. The material cache stuff doesn't really matter. I'm not animating anything. Polygon cache is important, and that's about it. So once you're happy with your scene, you just need to go to File, Save Project for Cineware, and now you are ready to jump into Unreal. Okay, so I have a fresh blank level in Unreal Engine 5.1. If you're also using 5.1, you should have the Datasmith stuff enabled by default, but to just check, just go to Edit, Plugins, type in Datasmith, and you should have the Cineware by Max on, C4D importer, all this stuff on. And if you don't, just enable it and then restart your engine. All right, so now we go to this drop-down menu. This drop-down menu, Datasmith, File Import, and then we'll look for our Cineware file. Once you've selected your file, choose where you want to save it. So I'm just going to save it in this geometry folder and hit OK. In the dialog box for the import, this should all be fine. I don't need animations, geometry, materials, textures, cameras is good. And now we can just hit import. So once your file's been imported, you might not be able to see anything because we have no lights. So we can just change the view mode to unlit, or you can hit Alt 3 and Alt 4 to go back and forth. So this is the file. And then what I'm gonna do is, I'm actually going to go into a 2-pane layout. So let me go into the right window, hit Alt 3, and then on this left window, I'm gonna go in the perspective drop down and select the camera. And this is the camera from our C4D file. One thing you'll need to change in the camera settings is, for example, if I add in a rectangular light here, you'll notice even though if I go to Alt 4 in my perspective view, you'll see I can see the light in this view but not in my camera view. And that is because for some reason, when Datasmith brings in the Cinema 4D camera, it kind of messes up the exposure settings. So just go to the camera, type in exposure, and then reset this to default. And now your camera has automatic exposure enabled. So now we're kind of ready to begin lighting. So I'm just gonna leave this rectangular light in here just so I can see. And I'm gonna change from the lit mode to to lighting only. So that way I kind of have a nice white card view of everything. You'll notice that the camera is a bit lower than the original render. That's because of the film offset thing that I mentioned earlier. So I'm just actually gonna go up to my camera. What I like to do is duplicate this. That way when I re-import the model, it doesn't reset my camera. So just select your camera, hit Control D, and that'll make another one. I'm going to call it cam01. And I'm also going to pilot this camera. And now I can kind of safely move this without messing up the original one. So I'll probably move it up a bit. All right, cool. So once you're happy with your camera setup, now we can really begin lighting and we'll stay in this white card mode. Also, sorry, one more quick tip to make sure you don't mess up your camera movement in this left window. Just select it, right click, transform, and then lock actor movement. So now we can't mess up this view. So for the lighting, obviously the main hero light is that sunlight beaming through the window and sort of grazing the back wall, creating those soft shadows. So let's work on that one first. Also, if you have any objects that are showing up as black and not lighting correctly, it's probably just flipped over the wrong way and the normals just got reversed during the export process. So all you got to do is rotate them, or later on we can make a material that is two-sided. All right, so for the sunlight, I'm going to grab a directional light, just drag it here, and then you can change the pivot from world to local using this or hitting Control and the tilde key. So let me rotate it this way. I can now probably delete this light, make a new folder called lights, drag that in there. Make another folder called Geo, drag the model in there, cool. So for the light, let me just try to get the angle right. I'll turn off snapping just so it's smoother. So about there looks all right. And now to get the softness, I will change the source angle to something like 5 or maybe like 7 is a bit more accurate. And now we need to fill the room as well. So I will get a rectangular light and place it outside the window. Turn on snapping again. Now I'll adjust the width and the height. So I'll probably make this one a bit brighter, like around a 25. And I'll reduce the sunlight brightness because it's quite soft in the original render that Ross did. So I'll probably make it like 5. Yeah, I'm happy with that for now. And next we need to add a skylight to sort of fill out these super harsh dark shadows as well. So let me go back up to the menu, grab a skylight, and I will use this plain mid-gray light to kind of act as an overcast lighting in the skylight. So just on the right, change it from captured scene to specified cube map, and then just drag in your HDRI. Turn up the resolution. I don't know if that'll do too much. Also, you'll notice it looks like there's no ceiling, and that's also because the roof is 2D. So you can just grab the roof and then just rotate it like that, and now we have proper shadows on the ceiling as well. So for now, this is an okay starting point. I think once we add some more materials in, it will sort of brighten up a bit because right now it's too dark. And we'll also be using a LUT or a lookup table for the camera because Ross also used one. So we'll just try to match the look that he went after. One more thing we can do to fill out these really dark shadows is if you get your light. By the way, to toggle on and off these icons, I'm just pressing G, and that toggles game mode on and off. So just to make the scene look cleaner. So just grab your rectangular light and you'll have this setting called indirect lighting intensity. So right now on default it's 1, but if I make it something like 5, you'll notice that really fills out the shadows a bit more. And now we're getting a lot closer to the original render. So I might do the same with the directional light too. So indirect lighting intensity, maybe something like 3. That's looking much better. And I also think I could probably reduce the brightness from 5 to something like 4 or 3 even. Yeah. and then maybe reduce the source angle a bit to something like 6. Just wanted a tad sharper. So this is a great starting point for our lighting. We're almost there. Now we can jump into the materials, see how that changes up the scene, and then refine the lighting a little more. Don't forget to save all, by the way. So for the materials, because nothing's been UV unwrapped, if I go to this mode, the unlit mode, you'll see all the stretched out UVs, and no one likes UV unwrapping. So we're gonna make a triplanar material. So we're gonna be making this triplanar material function. I'm not gonna go into too much depth about how it works, and I'll probably make a separate video on it. But essentially what's happening is we're getting the world position and splitting it up into the X, Y, and Z axis, and then inputting our texture into all 3 planes. So we split it up and then blend it with the with the vertex normals of an object, bring that all together, and then have the output, which sort of does all our mapping for us. And then we have a few material parameters that let us change the scale and the blending. So to get started, just go into a folder, any folder, right click, go to materials, and then material function. And I usually call it MF underscore for material function, and then triplanar base. Double click and open that up. In the description below, I've created a paste bin, which will let you copy paste this code or this blueprint code, and then you can just paste it into here. So really it'll just be like this, copy, and then when you paste it, it'll come in like this. Just drag it out to the left. The add output goes into the output result, and then you just hit apply and save, and now we have a triplanar function, material function. Now the next step is we'll create a base master material, a really simple one. So right click, material, M underscore base underscore triplanar. Inside it, just open it up. Cool. And then right click, do material function call. And then on the left in the drop down, grab your triplanar. So now if I double click this, it goes to our function, and we don't need to keep recreating this code in our material blueprint. If you want to learn a bit more about materials and parameters, my last video goes over a basic master material in Unreal Engine, and you can easily migrate that over to all your projects. So definitely check that out if you want to learn more. Once you have your triplanar material function in, right click, type texture object parameter. I'll call this diffuse, and then plug that in. And then what you can do is select both, hit Control D, rename this to roughness, and we will first plug this into base color, but I also want to be able to control the tint. So if you hold V and click, it'll bring up a vector parameter, call it tint, and then hold M and click. Oh, I accidentally changed that. Tint, hold M and click to get a multiply. Drag this into the A input, the tint into the B, and then drag this into the base color. Because it's a multiply, I will change the default to white, so on default it won't actually affect the texture, and then once we change it, it will. By the way, if your material is showing up black in the preview, which is some weird UE5 bug, just go to show and then uncheck background, and then now your preview should be fixed. For the roughness, we're going to add the ability to change the minimum and maximum roughness values. So grab a lerp or linear interpolate. Linear interpolate. You can also hold L and click. So get a linear interpolate, plug your roughness into the alpha, and then grab a scalar parameter, call it roughness underscore min for minimum, and then click your scalar parameter, Control D, and call it roughness max. By the way, I used S and clicked. All these shortcuts are in my tutorial video if you want to check that out. And then you can also type in scalar parameter if you need to. So I'm going to change the maximum value to 1 for both of these, plug the max into B, and then plug the lerp into the roughness. So that's our really basic setup for the triplanar maps. Super easy. So hit save, which should automatically apply. And then we can now close all of these out and then go to your base material. Right click, create material instance, and let's do the walls first. So for the walls, let's first drag it onto our object and then open it up. I'll first input my concrete. So I think it was 34 for the diffuse color and then 34 4K roughness. And I'm pretty sure the UV scale, I think that's all right. Yep, I should be fine. And then I'll just change the min max to 0.7 and 0.5, because you'll see when the minimum is 0, it's super glossy. So 0.5 should be good. And you'll notice already with this in there, it's the light, you can tell the light is quite bright. So once you start putting materials in, you can then adjust your brightness of light. So maybe this goes down to 15 and, you know, reduce the indirect intensity to like 2 or something. And you can just play around with these values. I'm just going to go ahead and apply all my materials to the scene now. So I got most of my materials done, and you'll notice it feels super bright and overexposed. So I just thought I'd show you that I would adjust the lighting again. So probably bring this down to 1. Go back to the rect light, that's all right. Maybe reduce this back to 1 for the indirect lighting intensity. And this can also go back down. Let me just check my reference render again. Yeah, that's all right. And then also maybe go down to 2.5, something like that could work. To fix any objects or geometry that are merging with the floor, I'll just move them up by like a decimal, so 0.05, and that should fix any clashing geo. For the metallic and glossy materials of the objects, I've just made an instance of the base material from my last tutorial. So I'll just apply them to the objects now. This is the setup, by the way, really simple. No maps involved at all, just a metallic material with a roughness of 0.35. And then I have like a dark gray in the color overlay. Okay, so that's the scene pretty much done. I might just adjust the white skirting, maybe a tad darker. Something like that could be good. And now we can go back into our scene to refine the lighting a bit. So you'll notice in Ross's original render, we are missing some of the highlights in the reflections on the top of the stool and the top of the table, as well as like some brighter sphere reflections here as well. So let's go ahead and art direct some of those reflections. If you want to learn more about the in-depth side of that, check out my art directing lights in UE5 tutorial. So what I'm going to do is grab a rectangular light, and then I might place it here. And what we want to do is scroll down in the details panel to lighting channels, change this from 1 to 0. And I think I've already done it on this object, but by default, your object will only be on lighting channel 0. So I'm also going to enable lighting channel 1. And now you'll notice that this light only affects any objects on lighting channel 1. So let me just, that's actually not too bad already. Also, if you're not sure, or maybe you're working on a scene where there is no reference, what you can actually do is go to the lit mode and go to path tracing. And now you'll know where the reflections are actually supposed to be. I use this tip all the time and covered it in my previous videos. So even if I turn off these rectangular lights, you'll see the reflections are completely accurate because it is using path tracing. So you can just go back and forth between path tracing and lit mode and then just try to match the two together. Sometimes I'll just take a screenshot of the path tracing once it's finished all the samples. So definitely a cool tip to do some look dev for your lighting. If you're getting this error where there's an X on your light, it's because your light is set to stationary and there's overlapping shadows. So you can just change it to movable. Another thing you can do is also play with the attenuation radius. So that is just pretty much the fall off of the light here. So maybe you have a lot of lights in your scene and you don't want it to affect or bleed onto other objects. So definitely play around with the attenuation radius. So I noticed the rug in my Unreal Engine file didn't have any thickness because the cloth surface was not baked down. So I'm back in C4D and I'm actually also going to reduce the displacer strength and then just connect these together. You can put this, hide it from both viewport and renderer, and that way it won't get exported. And then I'll just rename this to rug. And what we can do now is just resave for Cineware and overwrite our old file. Once it's finished exporting, go back to your project file, wherever you saved your geometry import, go to the Datasmith scene file, right click, re-import, and everything can be left the same. Now, what we can do is just reapply our material to it, which was this one. And now we should be good to go. Oh yeah, and we gotta just re-enable the lighting channel because it is a new object. All right, so now I'm pretty happy with where the scene is at. You'll notice that my camera looks a little different, and that is because I applied a LUT to the scene. So if I type in LUT, so this is it with it off and on. So really, I highly recommend going to the Unreal Engine documentation and just making your custom LUT. It takes like 5 minutes. If you don't want to do that, you can also just play with the color correction settings inside the camera itself or in your post-process volume. And also for my post-process volume, I don't think I covered it earlier. All I've done is if you just type in Lumen, I've just kind of upped the settings a bit so they have a higher quality final finish, so there's less noise, better reflection capturing and things like that. So you can just copy my settings here. I go over this in my art directing lights tutorial video as well. And also I think in my workflow video with C4D to UE5, so you can check it out for more in-depth explanations. And then the last thing you want to enable is infinite extend unbound, and that's about it. So let me just go back to my camera, type in LUT and enable my lookup table. So now I want to go over my sequencer settings and the render settings. So I set up a few extra cameras that you saw in the original render, and you've noticed, very simple, I've just animated some panning and zooming, the light rotation and temperature. To do this, really, you just got to drag in your camera. Like I'll make a test one, for example. Right click, cinematics, level sequence, cam test, and let me uncheck that. There we go. So I'll drag in a new camera, cinematic, cinecamera actor. In this, I'll pilot it. So say you're happy with this camera setup, just find the camera that you just made, drag it into your sequence, and it'll automatically create this track. And then you can play with the frames and things like that. If it doesn't create a track for some random reason, just go to camera cuts, plus camera, camera 6. And then now if I select this, this is the view you'll have. And then if you want to animate the lights, you can just drag in your light. And then in the track, add a transform. And this is where it lets you keyframe the transform values. So I can go into here, change the rotation, or you can do it in the viewport as well. You just gotta uncheck that. There we go. And then in this, I'll select that. And now you can play with the light angles, oh yeah, it automatically keyframes it for me. And then now you'll see you have now animated your light. For my render settings, if I go to the movie render queue here and then load in my preset config, I use a PNG sequence. You can also use EXI if you're going to do a lot more post-production on it and then enable ACEs and things like that. But for this, I was pretty happy with how it looked like in the viewport. So I decided to use PNG. Then deferred rendering is in by default, I'm pretty sure. For anti-aliasing, you have your method set to none, override anti-aliasing, and I use 32 samples. It's probably a bit overkill. You should be fine with 8 or 16, but it's a pretty simple scene, so I didn't mind going a little overboard on it. For console variables, I just have depth of field quality set to 4. And then in my output, I have my file name, tokens, and formats. Output resolution, make sure your frame rate here matches your sequencer frame rate. And that's about it. So for about a total of 1200 frames at almost 3K resolution at 32 samples, it took about 25 minutes on a single 3090. Hopefully you guys found this useful. It was pretty fun to recreate a scene from another software in Unreal, and I'm definitely going to try to do more of these in the future. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments down below. Again, shout out to Ross for letting me use this scene in the video. Check out his links below, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.